Spider-Man and Daredevil have been tied from the very beginning, with the first ever Daredevil issue cover basically saying, hey, remember when you introduced Spider-Man last year? Well, here's another guy that's kinda sorta like that. Since then, they have teamed up multiple times for many different reasons, and over the years, they have built a pretty strong friendship, but it never really made it to the screen outside of a couple of animated projects. Of course, that never stopped fans from asking for it. If you spend any time online at all, you've probably seen it, which at first may seem weird. I mean, Spider-Man has teamed up with a lot of heroes over the years, and so has Daredevil. So why the insistence on these two specifically? Well, you see, there's something about them that just works. Like I said at the start, the first issue of Daredevil very much called attention to Spider-Man. And just a few months after his own first issue, Daredevil crossed over to the Amazing Spider-Man number 16, where he helped Spider-Man take down the Ringmaster. This was so early on, by the way, that Daredevil still had his yellow costume, and while their friendship wouldn't actually be established for a couple more years, this is still one of his oldest relationships, losing only to Foggy Nelson and Karen Page. All of this to say, they go way back. But okay, that still doesn't explain why this particular pairing is one nerds all over the world have been desperately begging to see. So what's that about? Because on paper, they seem like complete opposites, right? You can see this contrast in many stories, like the death of Jean the Wolf. She was a police captain and a friend of Spider-Man who was murdered by the villain Sin Eater. He also killed Judge Horace Rosenthal, a friend of Matt Murdock. The story follows Daredevil and Spider-Man as they try to catch Sin Eater, though they have very different approaches, and very different personal stakes in the story. While Matt was friends with Judge Rosenthal, they weren't particularly close, at least not as much as Spider-Man and Captain the Wolf were, which made this personal for Spidey. Throughout the story, he's a lot angrier, more emotional, and more ruthless when it comes to Sin Eater facing the consequences for his actions. To the point that Daredevil has to hold him back and reason with him, which, wait, that seems a little backwards, doesn't it? I mean, isn't Spider-Man supposed to be the optimistic, quippy guy who sees good in everyone? And isn't Daredevil the more cynical, serious hero with a more complex sense of justice? Wouldn't most people consider Daredevil to be the more ruthless one? Yeah, so not quite. The thing is, the more stories you actually read with these characters, the harder it gets to just label them as the optimistic one or the dark one. And this story is a great example of that. Daredevil can be more serious, down to business, and ruthless. Think of when he actually tried to kill Bullseye after Elektra's death. Not too different from what Spider-Man is going through here, dealing with the death of someone close to him. But Daredevil is also an idealist who, at the end of the day, still wants to change the system and make his city a better place. Spider-Man may usually come across as a happy, optimistic guy cracking jokes while he fights the bad guys, but he's still a tragic figure behind the mask. He's lost a lot of people. He's constantly struggling in his personal life due to being a superhero, and sometimes, like here, he just gets fed up with all of it. The truth is, Spider-Man and Daredevil are actually a lot more similar than people think. It's why a Daredevil and Spider-Man team-up is practically mandatory in the comics every couple of years or so. Of course, you have the more obvious similarities. For example, they're both street-level, New York-based heroes, they both have heightened senses, and they're both protective of their secret identity, while also not always being great at keeping a secret identity. They understand the burden it places on their loved ones, and the risks that come with it if the secret ever gets out. When Matt is outed as Daredevil by the press, Pete is one of the first people to show his support, going so far as going to the Daily Bugle to defend Matt and Daredevil and denying the rumors to J. Jonah Jameson because he was worried about the impact this would have on Matt's personal life. Especially after the then recent loss of Karen Page. Peter offered Matt his support then too, even telling him his own dead girlfriend story. They've also, at different points, publicly admitted to being superheroes and suffer the consequences. And this is still just barely scratching the surface. What really makes this friendship work is that they both have this almost unhealthy sense of responsibility. Spider-Man, of course, has the great power, great responsibility line, but the same logic applies to Daredevil. And when you carry that kind of weight on your shoulders, it also comes with a lot of guilt. That's the kind of thing that both Spider-Man and Daredevil deal with over and over again. And they don't need to explain this to each other. They both know what it's like to go out every night knowing that they might not make it back. Because there's always going to be another person who needs help, another person they risk their lives for. And they both know that no matter how many people they can't save everyone. But that won't stop them from trying, no matter the cost. At the end of the day, I think that's what really makes their friendship, that sense of duty and responsibility. Neither of them know how to walk away or when to take a step back. But sooner or later, they'll always end up putting the mask back on and keep going, because that's who they are. And if you go back to the Death of Jean the Wolf story, I think that's exactly what you see. When it comes down to it, they're fighting for the same thing. Their stories are about more than just superheroes fighting crime in New York. Their stories about responsibility, guilt, sacrifice, and what it means to keep going even when you think you can't. Which is why it's kind of crazy that we've never actually seen this friendship being fully adapted into any medium. Because we've spent decades watching these two characters understand each other in the comics. So, what happened? Well, the short answer is studio rights. Like I mentioned at the start, they've crossed paths in animations before, but Daredevil never really stuck around long enough for them to build the kind of friendship that they have in the comics. And as far as live action goes, for years, Spider-Man and Daredevil were doomed to live in completely different cinematic universes. Spider-Man was with Sony, Daredevil was with Fox, then Daredevil eventually went back to Marvel, but Spider-Man didn't, at least not in the same way. Marvel and Sony worked out a deal that allowed Spider-Man to be in the MCU movies, but that came with its own set of problems. You see, Marvel and Sony have this weird divorced parents kind of relationship with Spider-Man. Like they're in a custody battle where Spider-Man lives with Sony but gets to spend the weekend with Marvel, you know? And they basically had to learn how to share. Not just Spider-Man, but other characters as well. While we don't really know the specifics of their contract, I think it's safe to assume that part of it is essentially for each non-Spider-Man movie that Spider-Man makes an appearance, Sony gets to use an MCU character in a Spider-Man movie. Like, Spider-Man was in Captain America's Civil War, that's cool, Iron Man gets to be in Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man was in the Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, well, Far From Home and No Way Home get to have Nick Fury and Doctor Strange. And while all of this is happening, Daredevil was over on the Netflix side of the MCU, technically part of the same universe, but mostly disconnected from it. Then, a lot of stuff happened. Netflix canceled Daredevil. Spider-Man almost left the MCU. Until, finally, we got Spider-Man No Way Home. This movie was a big deal for a lot of reasons, of course, but for our purposes, it meant Spider-Man got to stay in the MCU, and it marked not only Charlie Cox's return after a 3-year hiatus following the cancellation of the Daredevil show, but also the first ever live-action encounter between Spider-Man and Daredevil. His part in No Way Home was brief. Not even 2 minutes long. And he doesn't even put on the Daredevil suit. We still got a little hint of who he really is, and of course Peter picked up on it, but this was still far from the team-up we've always wanted to see. After that, Spider-Man went back to Sony's house, and we didn't get to see him spend the weekend with Marvel for a while. And even if he did, it was a little unlikely that they just let him show up in a TV show rather than a big movie screen anyway, meaning no Spider-Man and Daredevil Born Again either. The best we could do was an offhand reference all the way back in the second episode. Times seem to be changing though. Spider-Man Brand New Day is already bringing in familiar faces from the Netflix era of shows such as The Punisher, which is fitting. The guy did debut on a Spider-Man comic, but also The Hand, a ninja cult hellbent on immortality. While it's not too weird for Spider-Man to fight them, The Hand is much more commonly associated with, you guessed it, Daredevil. It feels like Daredevil's corner of the MCU is slowly creeping further and further into Spider-Man's territory, which is exciting to see. So, for the first time ever, it actually feels like we're getting closer to seeing a real Spider-Man and Daredevil team up on the big screen. Obviously, I can't say that's going to happen, but the current landscape is pretty optimistic. So, now that so many of the obstacles that kept them apart are finally disappearing, the question is, can the MCU pull it off? Ugh, you know how scary it is to talk about Spider-Man on the internet? Terrifying. If you're a big Spider-Man fan who disagrees with anything I said, feel free to let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. And if you're watching Brand New Day wondering what the deal was with all those ninjas, you can check out this video right here. I'll see you next time. Bye.